So today I'm going to talk about the most common mixing mistakes that I've seen on submithub and a few other places. I may have gone on over this in earlier videos a little bit, but I just thought I'd be a bit more specific about it. Probably the number one mistake that I see by far across all the mixes is too much mastering compression, too much limiting, or just too much compression on individual tracks and too much limiting in general. And I've gone over this in earlier videos in my loudness video as to why this is not a goal that you should be aiming for. And I'm pretty emphatic about that, and I'm not going to change my mind. But, you know, there are other reasons. If you just listen to tracks that have been over-compressed, over-limited, it's immediately apparent that they're not reaching their full potential. Sometimes I've heard really great songs on submithub that have just been ruined by compression, like really just stuffed up. You can hear that if they were a little bit more open, a little bit more expansive, had a little bit more dynamic range in them, there would have been, I would say, like 25% better tracks in terms of their impact and what you get out of listening to them and this sort of thing. Compression seems to have become the go-to for mixing engineers, or at least, you know, novice mixing engineers, in terms of making something sound good. Whereas my advice, and the advice of every mix engineer I've ever read on, has been, you know, mixing is EQ, and you should be making your mixes good with EQ first, and then everything else comes later. So I think people nowadays tend to over-rely on compression and limiting as a way of changing the sound and trying to make things sound good, whereas, you know, with a little bit more experience and a little bit more thought and a little bit more attention, you can do that with EQ and overall have a mix that's, as I said, probably 25% better to listen to. The second most common mistake that I hear is not enough EQ separation, and I've gone over EQ and EQ separation in a previous video, but briefly, you know, you want to have different spaces carved out in the EQ spectrum for your different tracks, generally speaking, and for some genres of music this isn't as important. And the fewer instruments you have, this becomes less important depending on the instrument and how much of the frequency space they take up. But for most mixing with pop and rock and electronic stuff, usually on submithub and whatever, I find that either A, people just haven't done any EQing, or B, people kind of did it but didn't really do it terrifically well, and the different instruments are all masking each other, and this becomes way more apparent once you start adding compression and limiting. Even without that, you have a mix that is kind of not necessarily unpleasant to mix to listen to, but is just sort of uncomfortably muddy and blended together, and it doesn't sound very professional, whatever that means, right? But once you start to add compression and limiting, then the effect of not having those instruments separated becomes much more apparent. The more compression you have, the more EQ separation you need between your tracks, right? Because the compression brings up those low volume frequencies. So if you haven't already done some strong work to separate out those tracks from each other in the EQ spectrum, when you add mastering, compression, or limiting, you know, those, whatever separation you've created in the first place is going to be reduced. And if you haven't created any separation, then things just become way more blended together in general. So you had something, say you have a track where you haven't done any EQ and you've got a piano and a guitar, and maybe the piano's in the center and stereo and the guitar's off to this side, or maybe it's, you know, left and right hard panned or whatever. And those two instruments have a certain amount of overlap in the frequency space. They've got little bits that are more distinct, but, you know, there's a fair amount of overlap. They're both fairly mid-heavy instruments. Once you start adding compression and limiting onto your mastering channel, the differences between those two instruments become much less apparent, because all of the dominant frequencies, the louder ones, are being pushed down, and the less dominant ones, the lower volume frequencies, are being pushed up. So you run the risk of everything turning into a bit of a mush, right? The more compression you use and the less EQ you use. So as a general rule, in terms of the mixing that I'm hearing on submithub, work on your EQ, stop doing compression. Like, I mean, just stop doing compression. I'm not saying stop doing compression forever, just like for a couple of tracks, just stop doing compression. Do everything with volume writing, do everything with EQ, and try and make a mix that sounds good just on that basis. Without any compression, without any limiting. Challenge yourself, you know. That's a challenge to you. Once you can do that, once you can make a mix sound good with just EQ and just volume writing, then you can start using compression and limiting for what they're meant to be used for, just as a way of just making the sound of the instrument better, because of what the compression does, because of what the limiting does, not because you're compensating for a lack of EQ skills or a lack of volume writing or whatever, right? Those are really the main things that I hear. I have to say, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that I'm hearing out there has some bad singing. Sorry, I don't mean to insult anybody, but and I'm also not an elitist when it comes to singing. I like singing in a lot of different styles, but some of the singing that I'm hearing out there, either people are going out of tune a heck of a lot, or they don't really know quite how to work their voice and they're kind of holding all their tension in their throat, or it just sounds too nasal as a result. Or they just have poor mic technique and they're not getting close enough to the mic or further away enough from the mic, and it's just not sounding that good. So a lot of people out there need to work on their vocals, and I've done a previous video on, you know, basic exercises for improving your vocal delivery. So go and have a look at that if you want to. Another submithub mistake that I would say isn't a mixing mistake, but I would say is just a general mistake, is creating a video before your song is actually ready. Personally, I find that videos on places like submithub, where you're just trying to listen to the track, are actually just kind of distracting. And if you've got a really crummy video, it's going to detract from the quality of your song. You know, there's no point in putting out a really well-mixed, really highly polished piece of greatness in terms of music, and then having a video that is quite off-putting or just quite amateurish or whatever. You're better off just not having the video if that's the case. If you want to have a video, make sure it's something that's interesting, that people want to watch, that isn't too distracting from the music, that reinforces the music rather than distracting away from it, you know? So that's just an attention bias thing. People tend to attribute bad music to bad visuals. Funnily enough, it doesn't work in reverse. And the last thing I'd say, and again this isn't a mixing thing, but I hear a lot of repetition in a lot of the tracks on submithub in particular. Particularly in electronic music, I'll find that people have their first half of the track and the second half of the track is kind of just a cut and paste without any changes or additional instruments or anything that's moving at all, and that's not interesting. Somebody can just loop the track if that's what they want. But I haven't heard any professional, you know, highly praised electronic music or anything like that where they've just cut and pasted and haven't made any changes, because it just tends to get samey and boring. When you're doing acoustic music or anything that's on a live instrument, that kind of repetition doesn't matter so much, because there's differences in the playing in the second verse and the second chorus, even if the lyrics are the same, even if the chords are the same, even if the melodies are the same, the person who's playing it is going to be playing it slightly differently. So with analog instrumentation, you naturally get that kind of change happening. With electronic instrumentation and synth-based stuff, you have to do that more manually, and you have to be a bit more conscious about not being repetitive, not just doubling up the track for the sake of making a long piece. But again, that's not a mix thing. So one final note for submithub and that sort of thing, and I have mentioned this in the past, is I think it's a mistake to release stuff before you've had it reviewed in, like, either on forums or on Reddit or in the submithub hot or not section. I think you should be doing that first, putting it out there for people to comment on and get back to you and say, oh, this is weak, that's really good, this is weak. Do that before you release stuff on Spotify or whatever, because honestly, like 90% of the stuff that I've heard on Spotify, on submithub or whatever, that's already been released on Spotify should not have been released. Like, either there were bad mix mistakes that makes it something that was never going to get anywhere in the first place, or it's just unlistenable. And it's much easier nowadays with the dearth of services out there, and even some free services allowing you to get your stuff on Spotify and whatnot, or just put it up there yourself on Spotify. You know, you can do that, but you probably shouldn't. You know, you should probably get your stuff to the point where it's really solid and you've taken people's feedback into account and then put it out there. That's just my opinion. Thank you.